Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our final exam clinic of the academic year, which bet half you thought we'd ever get to this point. I can see there's lots of questions in the chat as well. Some people not feeling entirely confident, but that's exactly why we're here tonight. We're joined by Anne, Laura and Anna, and you could not be in safer hands with this trio of specialists. So we're going to answer all your questions. We are going to go through a lot tonight. You've got issues and debate, you've got all your optional topics. Ask us anything that we can answer, we will. Anything we don't get round to, pop over to Instagram and ask us again. We are answering every single question that comes to us on direct message or on our feed. A reminder that you can watch this back, and then you can also watch back some of the other ones, especially the one that we did last night on issues and debates, which was great. So we'll get straight on to it. We're starting with you, Anne. So questions in the chat.
I'm just looking, I'm just waiting for some questions to come up. No, I can't. It's his lagging, I think. Yeah, they're saying it's buffer. Can you go over a levels of explanation question, like 6 or 8 marks? I think at this point it's difficult for us to go through an exact question, what you would want to answer there. It's just be prepared for a question like that, and be aware that when they're asking a question like that, it is asking about the sort of reductionism. Because there was a question last year, an essay question on it last year, and I think had they not given a little scenario at the top, that referred to reductionism and holism, I think students would have done really badly and wouldn't have had a clue what they meant by levels of explanation. And in fact, most of the answers didn't really incorporate the actual levels of explanation in, and the idea of these being, sort of biological explanations at the bottom, and so on, and becoming more holistic. Okay, it is. Sorry, it's a bit laggy tonight. We are trying to read the comments, but the chat isn't coming up very quickly. Yeah,
Laura, I'm just wondering, just while we're waiting, just for the comments to come through, if you could just put the spec on for issues and debates.
Oh, sorry.
Or
that was a happy birthday, Fran. There we go. Here you go.
Yeah, this would help. I think always you need to be very aware of what is back, especially in this section, because there are a lot of key terms in there that you need to be aware of and that you can be asked specific questions on. So, look for those kind of small words in there, really, which is why I think that levels of explanation threw students last year. So things like you've got universality and bias under gender and culture. And then I'm trying to pick up some other small ones. I think that people have been asking about social sensitivity. That's something in there that's important. And also remember with the debates that they are a debate, and you do need both sides of the debate when you're answering those questions. Can we do the full course? No, afraid not. I've got this one by Neve Bennett. This is an interesting question about you need an introduction, a conclusion for issues in debates. I mean, my advice would be, these are so short questions, and I think the others would back me up here. You've only got 16 marks. You're only writing these in 20 minutes. I would just get right in there and just get in with answering the question. Don't bother. Don't bother with an introduction.
No.
Don't bother with a conclusion. Just answer the question. You really haven't got time for that, and you're not including any extra information in those that are going to be picking up additional marks. So yeah, don't go there. Just get in there and just answer. I like Zabs. Everybody just try your best. It'll all be all over soon. Okay, so I'm going to pass over to Anna now and see if she can pick a question.
Well, I was just picking up on the one that you just said, Anne, there, just to reiterate, I think it's quite a bad habit to get into, is to treat it like it's an essay for English, not an essay for science, and get into the habit of intro and conclusion. So I think maybe what the teacher was trying to say in that was just what you were saying earlier about when something's a debate, it's not binary, it's not one or the other. So maybe they were telling them to kind of conclude in a way to say that, there's somewhere along a spectrum that this might fall. That's the only way I can pick up that, that might be useful. We've also got something here. Someone was asking about alpha and beta bias in reference to culture. I'm not sure if you can find that comment, Laura. There you go. So if you and again, this is just about you knowing the specification. So if Laura could just put the spec back up just on the slide, and it's quite clear, I think, on the specification how that would come up in the exam. So if you look there, it says, where have we got it? Alpha and beta bias, but that's in the context of gender bias. So it says gender bias, including androcentrism and alpha and beta bias. So what that means is if you're asked about alpha and beta bias in the exam, the expectation is you would be writing about gender. However, if it is a question on cultural bias, the terms alpha and beta could also apply to culture, so you're not going to lose any marks for referencing them. But what I will say is, if there is explicit reference to them, I think the expectation will be that that's done in the context of gender there. There's a question there, if you can see, it says user_Rosie. It says about the idiographic and nomothetic approaches on there. Can you see that one, Laura?
Yeah, it is
and
user
again,
Rosie, user _
yeah. And again, this is, I think that people get a little bit confused about idiographic and nomothetic, because this is about how we carry out a piece of research. So it's thinking about what's the kind of nature of the research method involved. If it's kind of idiographic, it's going to be kind of case study, focusing on kind of qualitative data, whereas nomothetic is more like your scientific methods. So you're thinking of approaches like behaviorist and biological, etc. But I think, yeah, so idiographic and nomothetic, think more about it's how that approach carries out the research for it. There you go. Laura, do you want to have a pick up on a couple of them?
Sure. We've got Jasmine loves bagels. So Jasmine is asking if the question asks you to refer to a topic in psychology, does it count as AO2 or AO3? Usually AO2, and I just want to say this, that what I sometimes find is when it says refer to a topic in psychology, refer to something specifically, students try, well, they think and they attempt to refer to that at every single paragraph. If it asks you to refer to something, if you've referred to it well in your AO1, it doesn't mean you have to then refer to it forcefully in your AO3. So again, got to be in context there. So hopefully that answers that question. So you could potentially, basically, Jasmine, apply a scenario into your AO3. Okay, it'd still be your application marks though. It'd still be AO2. We also have, where is it? I found it. Prue Gilder has said, what is the most important information to know within issues and debates? And I'm sure this is a question across the spec with like, what do we actually need to know? Well, the answer to that, I'm sure some of you will predict what I'm going to say, and that is the specification. It is your Bible. Literally, your paper and the examination questions, if you like, are created based on that wording. So someone asked earlier about, do we need to know alpha and beta bias specifically for gender bias? And my answer to that is yes. Why do I know that confidently? Because in the specification, it says gender bias, androcentrism, beta and alpha. So it means that the examiner could potentially ask you a question on one of those specifically. So again, go by the specification wording, know that you do need to have research, and examiners really like that and have a preference for it in AO3 and evaluation sense. There was another question in here, but my time's probably up, isn't it? I'll hand back over to Anne while I look for another question. Can I?
I know there's a lot of questions coming through that are for very specific areas, but what we have to be aware of with paper 3 is it is an options paper, and different people will be doing different options. And so, we can't really spend a lot of time going through options because it's not fair on the others. I've just seen a question, where can they access the specification? But students have answered, if you just Google AQA, psychology specification, A-level specification, you will find it. It's not difficult to find at all. And I really, really would recommend that you do that, because you really do need to make sure that you've covered everything on there. How many examples of topics or research do we... Oh, go on.
Sorry, Anne. Thought I was going for another question.
No, it's you can go on.
Got a question.
If you've got a question, you spot it.
By Emily L188. Can you please explain the difference between androcentrism and alpha bias? Yeah, quite easily to get these muddled. So alpha bias, I want to talk about how you might remember that difference firstly between alpha and beta, and then I'll say the other difference. Think of alpha like the big, like the lead, alpha male, alpha female. Okay, so it's all about big, exaggerating the differences, and beta is the opposite. It's minimizing, right? The differences between genders. Androcentrism is the idea that, let's say theories, ideologies, explanations have been created based on a male view and world. Okay, and if female behavior therefore differs from that, it's seen as atypical or abnormal, unusual, if you like. So that's the difference between, your androcentrism is more to do with a world that has been designed and created for males, and if anything differs from that, it's seen as abnormal in terms of the different sexes. And alpha is specifically an exaggeration of differences basically between males and females. So over to you, Anne.
Okay, I think it was Christy that was asking about how much to write for 8-mark questions. Yeah. Now, obviously, this is a difficult question to ask because different people can write different amounts, write quicker than others. If you think about an 8-mark question, you have only got 10 minutes tops to answer it. So it's kind of as much as you can write in 10 minutes. And I always kind of with my students, recommend that they kind of practice writing quickly in the run up to exams, because it is such an important skill. I think the important thing with 8 markers, and the thing you need to think very carefully about, is the balance of AO1, AO2 if it is an applied one, and AO3, because students often do mistime it really. So if it's a standard 8 marker short essay, it will only be 3 marks AO1, 5 marks AO3. Okay, so you need to balance that, because students will often overwrite and write as much AO1 as perhaps they would write in a 16 marker, and then tag on a little bit of evaluation at the end. I think what is even harder is when it's an applied 8 marker, because then you've got your 3 marks AO1, your 2 marks AO2, and 3 marks AO3 evaluation. And so many students, when they're faced with that, will miss one of them out. So they'll typically either miss the AO2 or the AO3 out. So it's not how much, it's how much time to for each of those skills. Don't overwrite the AO1 at the expense of the others. Okay, I think, does anybody have any model answers? Well, I know Tutor to You does have all sorts of model answers. So, that's somewhere that you could have a look at. Is an approach an example of a topic, Lottie? That is a good question. When they're asking you to bring in information from topics, it's just anything really that you've been taught about in psychology. So yes, approaches is an example of a topic. So don't worry about that. Just bring in examples and things from things that you've learnt about. I think, and again, Amelia's put, how many examples of topics and research do we need for ethical implications? It's hard to put numbers on. I think always ethical implications in itself is tricky, because ethical implications is not the same as ethical issues, and students get these mixed up so much. So when you're thinking about ethical implications, that is the effect that it has. It's not the issue, it's the effect that would have on people, either the people who take part in the research, or when you're talking about socially sensitive research, people from the groups that they represent. So always kind of sort that out. Ethical implications is kind of, what does it do? What are the implications? So if you're talking about harm to whoever, so just watch that one. Okay, Anna, should I pass over to you?
Yeah, sure. There was a comment, it came up a while ago actually, I think it was from OK, and they said, how do you evaluate cultural bias? And I think this is just something just to pull out across the board in terms of issues and debates, is you're thinking about not so much of strengths and weaknesses. You can't really say a strength of cultural bias. You're thinking about what the implications and consequences of that are. So that's going to be your evaluation. So again, this is where, paper 3 is slightly more difficult, especially when it comes to issues and debates. So just look at the structure of the AO3s that you've got and just check the language, just for your signpost, for your original first part of that kind of burger is correct. So an implication of cultural bias is, and talk through what the effect of cultural bias, for example, has been on psychology. Somebody also said, will there be 3 16-mark questions? And the fact of the matter is, you just don't know. You don't know what AQA are going to do, just as we don't know, and we wouldn't go into trying to say that X, Y, and Z won't be on the exam, because we don't know what AQA is going to do. And you saw that with paper 2, with a lot of the topics from last year coming up again on paper 2. So I think that's a little bit of advice to you, is don't say, I'm not revising X, because you think it was on last year's paper, because I think when you sit in the exam you could be really disappointed in that one. Somebody also asked as well, I think it was I Am Phoebe, they said, what's the difference between determinism and nature versus nurture? And actually, that's a really sophisticated question that you've asked there, because what you've recognized is that nature and nurture in themselves is determinism. They're just the different types of determinism. So obviously, they're part of separate issues and debates, and we don't want to conflate them and write about them at the same time. But, you know, nature in itself is the idea that behavior is determined by our physiology, and nurture is the idea that our behavior is determined by our environment. So I would say the difference in them are in the label, that I would talk about determinism in a different way if it was a determinism question, and I wouldn't reference nature and nurture in it. What else did we have here? Oh, somebody said about the scientific emphasis on causal explanations. And again, Laura, if it's okay, we just pop the spec back up just so people can see where that phrase is coming from. I know it was mentioned a few times on the quiz last night. So if you look there on the second bullet point, you can see it says it's about free will and determinism, and it says a scientific emphasis on causal explanations. So what that basically means is that science is about determinism. Science is about looking at causal relationships, identifying variable X that results in a particular change. So it's ultimately saying that in science, there is an emphasis on looking for causal explanations, and science in itself is deterministic, I would say. Laura, I'll pass back over to you.
Thank you so much. I've literally just lost my questions that I was going to answer. The first one by Stefania. She's saying, do we need to know about Cyber and Stanley's 4 criteria when looking at socially sensitive research? So I'm just going to go to a slide now we've got on the PowerPoint for socially sensitive research tips, which I know is a question that has kept propping up. So Laura, if we could go to the slide. Sensitive research, these are just some of our tips to you guys. Use key terms like taboo, implications, social consequences, and don't forget, when it comes to Cyber and Stanley's 4 criteria, you know, it's good to outline them, okay, in order to be able to identify whether a piece of research is actually socially sensitive. So there are 4 prompt questions there as well. Try and always think, and this is just a general rule with issues and debates, really with any key specialist AO1 terms, is to always have examples ready so that you can, and we were talking about this before this live started actually, you want to give examples in your AO1 to demonstrate terms, to demonstrate to the examiner that you've got that depth of knowledge, that it's not just surface knowledge, you can actually apply it and understand it in a real life scenario or setting. So that's really important. In terms of while we're on the topic of socially sensitive, we just go to the next slide, which is an essay structure. I think quite a few students have been asking this about the question, discuss socially sensitive research. So if we were going to plan this, if you like, and obviously we all encourage you to use the planning box in the exams, we always say, because AQA have definitely noticed those students that use the planning box tend to do better and perform better than those students that leave the planning box blank. So for this, our plan would be, you know, what is socially sensitive research? Firstly, give that definition. And what does it look like? Give some examples to illustrate that. In terms of the discussion, remember that the word discuss is very different from a simple outline and evaluate essay. Okay. With discuss, we really want to making sure we're giving strength and a weakness in our evaluation at least. Okay. So we've discussed socially sensitive research. We really want to be thinking about things like the implications again. So we've got this cost benefit here as a part of our plan for our AO3. So we can see here with costs, obviously the implications, the negative implications of the costs, such as the negative impact on policies. Again, always give examples if you can. Fueling or reinforcing negative stereotypes and prejudice as well is an issue with socially sensitive research. However, on the flip side of those, we can say it can improve ethical guidelines in the future by identifying those pitfalls, and researchers can consider those 4 questions that we showed you on the last slide by Cyber and Stanley. And lastly, not all socially sensitive research is controversial. the effect of age on eyewitness testimony help to learn that children can be reliable witnesses, for example. Okay, so hopefully that answers a few questions there on that specific topic. I'm just going back over to questions. Look, has anyone spotted a question?
Going back to those things that those slides that we've got, Amara asked how to structure a 16 marker for issues and debates. Now, I believe we've got a slide, haven't we, that we could use for that. Yeah, I think, do we have a generic? Well, this gives you an idea anyway. It gives you an idea of an essay structure. If you had a question out and free will debate, refer to one or more examples for your specification. So for your AO1 then, you can talk about what the debate actually is. You could talk about the different types of determinism, what we mean by free will. And then within there, you can give your AO2. So that's where you can include your examples. So you can include examples like humanism as being an example from free will, and any the biological approach or any of the biological explanations. You know, if you're doing something like schizophrenia, bring in a biological explanation for schizophrenia to show biological determinism. So it's just pulling in bits of, information that you've learned, in for the rest of the, for the rest of the specification to actually help you there. And then moving in to think about the kind of pros and cons of free will and of determinism. Because a good thing about free will is that it's more compatible with our legal system. That's how our legal system works. It sees you as being responsible for your actions, but it's not compatible with the aims of science. For determinism, there is some support. Remember, research to support something is really useful. So if you've not come across Libet et al., then I'd be looking for that one because that is a good one. But you can argue it's too focused on cause and effect, and it can end up being socially sensitive. Again, you might bring in examples there, because you can bring in your examples as part of your discussion or as part of your description. So that gives you just a little kind of format that you could use for for an issues and debates essay, because they are a little bit different than when you're outlining and evaluating a theory or a study. So that's important to bear in mind.
Yeah, can I just, sorry, I was just going to pick up on a point there that we just had a bit of a discussion about just by Louisa. And Louisa was asking about, if you're doing determinism and free will, could you do a pro for determinism as it being scientific, and then the con for free will as it not being scientific? And then somebody's answered in respect to that, just saying it might be a little bit of repetition. And I think they're right there. So I just think, Louisa, hi Louisa, one of mine, just be really careful how you use that, because you want to avoid repetition. So if you could talk about your pro for determinism being scientific and that in something in terms of maybe what's that's led to for determinism, and then the con for free will in the same way, that might work. But you might just be better off just to do that as a kind of paragraph with a little bit of a line of argument in it, rather than think you can get away with doing quite too simple, straightforward AO3s on that, because I think you can go into a little bit more detail and a little bit more complexity with those answers. Just to pick up another misconception as well, Moon Knight, it was earlier on, said, for ethical implications, do we just give the BPS ethical guidelines? There we go. So for a question on ethical implications, would you simply have to identify factors within the BPS ethical guidelines? Would you? Yeah, I think you've gone around that the wrong way. So that links back to kind of what Anne and Laura were saying earlier. A question on ethical implications is not a question on ethics. Ethical implications is a wider area, and we often talk about social sensitivity. And when we're talking about social sensitivity, we're talking about ethical implications, and that's that overlap between those two topics. So a piece of research that's socially sensitive is just more likely to have ethical implications because it's a taboo area. But yeah, just to highlight that, and I know when ethical implications has come up in the exam, so many students just go down the route of thinking it's a question on ethics, and it's not actually a question on ethics.
Yeah,
Okay, we've
Rosie
got
said that as well. Rosie Wayne. Oh, sorry, she'd put what's. I've just lost it. Rosie Wayne, I think, is what the difference between social sensitivity and ethical implications. Well, social sensitivity is an example of an ethical implication. So if you get a question on ethical implications, then you can just write about social sensitivity. Remember, ethical implications, they're the consequences of research being carried out in a certain way. So if you think implications is consequences, I think that really helps. But so they're not different. Social sensitivity is an example of an ethical implication.
Okay, we've got
Laura,
a question here by Amelia. Could you say family explanations for schizophrenia are socially sensitive? Yes, you can, but it's the elaboration there. And actually, funny enough, Jasmine Loves Bagels, exactly what I was going to say. Yeah, and that's because of the schizophrenic mother. It's socially sensitive to mums and puts pressure on them, but also the wider family as well, and kind of blame making, if you like. Okay, so they can take a lot of that kind of blame and responsibility on, and that can obviously be quite damaging and socially sensitive, as Jasmine has said. So really well done on identifying that. We've got another question by Meow. What is an example of an approach in psychology that's idiographic? Yeah, so there's just one thing that I just want to mention here before I give you the answer for this, and that is a lot of students make the mistake of saying that psychodynamic is idiographic. And I just want to iron that crease out and say that Freud's psychodynamic theory is very much nomothetic because he's created general laws. Remember the tripartite personality, the psychosexual stages. However, it's a bit fuzzy because obviously Freud uses and utilizes some idiographic research methodology, such as case studies. But the general gist is the actual theory itself is a general law and applied to many. So we would say it's nomothetic in that sense, but I can appreciate why that's a bit confusing, if you like, because he uses idiographic methods. Okay. So in terms of
sorry, Laura,
yeah.
can I just pick up on that point, Laura? Because I think we could sit here all night really and debate over this. And I always say to my students, that's why people don't like Freud, because in effect he broke the laws of science in that he used a lot of idiographic methods to create nomothetic theories, and indeed wanted to be seen in that way in terms of making general laws. But yeah, I would perhaps argue that he was slightly more idiographic than you mentioned there.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with you. But in terms of, I guess the theory they learn in psychodynamic, we can arguably say that is definitely a general law. But yeah, propped up on idiographic methodology for sure. So in terms of the idiographic approach, you're referring to humanistic. Why are you referring to humanistic? It's about the study of a unique individual. Okay, and we need to remember when we're arguing that something is either nomothetic or idiographic to link that with the theory. In other words, what makes something idiographic? Okay, we're studying the I, the individual, the unique experience of them, and usually that's going to generate data that's usually qualitative. That doesn't mean we can't have quantitative data, but it tends to be more descriptive, more case study orientated. Okay, so hopefully that answers your question. But yeah, most of the approaches that you cover in psychology are of a nomothetic value. Okay, there's only a couple of areas where you can apply the idiographic framework, if you like. Over to you, Anne. I've lost my next question. So.
It's okay. I've been watching the chat because Cheesy What's It had asked for some help to make revision more interesting, and there were some wonderful suggestions from the students. So that's really, really lovely. And I was trying, somebody mentioned the Pomodoro method, and I was trying to think of the name for it, and then it just popped up. Yeah, so short burst of revision, and then have a break. And there's apps that you can get on your phone to help you with that. It is about changing activities, I think, not trying to sit and do the whole thing. And people had mentioned looking at videos, and and there are some good videos. I mean, obviously, Tutor to You's got some useful videos and things. So just changing the activities. But yeah, students really helping each other. I spotted this question ages ago, so I don't know if Laura can find it. It was from Zab, and it was about talking about nurture without feeling like nature versus nurture. And I thought this was a really good question, because again, this was on as an essay a few years ago now, and it was really, really, kind of, there were some good answers, but there were some really poor answers. And in fact, students talking about the nurture debate. and the nature debate, which is clearly not right because there is only one debate and it's nature, but it isn't nature versus nurture, and you're right to identify that. It's more about the relative contribution of nature and nurture. Now, these days nobody's going to say it's one or the other, and in fact, interactionism has come much more become much more prominent. And so that's what you need to focus on, really. It's not thinking about it. I mean, kind of the older, kind of explanations were more, your biological explanations are more on the nature side, your behaviorists are more on the nurture side. But when you think about the topics that you look at, you see that it is an interaction and that both have a role to play. And it is keeping that in mind, that it's not one or the other, it's the relative contribution. In fact, it's moved on from that to now it being, accepted that you cannot separate them out because they are, so intertwined together. So I thought that was a really good question. And please don't talk about the nature debate or the nurture debate. Okay, so that was a good question. I think I've done this. I've done most of mine. I've got
one,
down.
Anne, that I
Oh,
just
have
want
you got
to
one
pull
there?
in,
Go on.
actually. Yeah, when we were talking about the socially sensitive for schizophrenia, this is a discussion that we were having, actually. I think Laura's got a slide just to put on here. It's just a bit of a word of caution, I think. I know that a lot of you are in kind of schools or colleges where they recommend that, in a large 16 markers, you have an issues and debates paragraph in it. And just to let you know, AQA there's nothing that AQA have ever said in this specification that you have to do this. But if you do it effectively, it can be very good. So what I would say to you is, if you are using issues and debates as part of your evaluation, you have to explain why, in the sense, that issue and debate is particularly relevant. So we've put an example here on the screen of, 3 different levels in terms of making sure that your evaluation is effective. So, this whole concept of reductionism, for example, if I'm going to use it as an evaluation, I have to explain why that particular explanation, being reductionist, is a problem. And the best way to do that is to point to kind of other examples. And it's the same with everything else. I always say to my students, there's nothing wrong with a theory being deterministic. If psychology is a science, we should be deterministic. The problem is, and this is again with wording, is if something is too deterministic. So if I was using reductionism or determinism as an issue in my evaluation, I would just use the word "to" in front of it. Because, like I said, reductionism itself is good, it's science, as is determinism. So just, like I say, just beware. And I know it's come out in examiner report after examiner reports that a lot of the time where issues and debates is used in the other topic areas, it's not used effectively. So please don't just use it as a throwaway evaluation in that sense. Also, just to pick up quickly, somebody said, can I start with the options first and then do issues and debates? You can do whatever you want in terms of the paper, but just make sure that you just know your timing all the way through. So without extra time, it's just 30 minutes on every section.
Could I just come in there, Anna? Because somebody's mentioned about it being a blank booklet. Yeah, this is different from your other exams because the exam paper is separate to the booklet that you write in. Now, you can write your answers in any order that you want to, but please make sure that you number them clearly. Because it's whole paper marked this as well. So the examiner needs to know which question it is that you're actually answering. So make sure that, make sure that you label them carefully, particularly if you're not doing them in the order that they come into the paper. So it will be a bit different than your previous exams where the question and there's been space for your answers in the actual booklet. So just be aware of that. And I think we were talking earlier as well, be aware that there will be research methods questions in there too. So don't just think because you've done and dusted with paper 2, you're done and dusted with research methods, because you aren't, and there can be questions in there on what statistical test you can use. There could be mathematical questions. So you need to make sure that you've got a calculator with you. So make sure that you're prepared for that. Okay.
We've got a question here by Jessie. She's asking, or he's asking, sorry, how much detail do we need for cognition and development questions, i.e. Piaget? And what I'm going to point you in the direction of, again, if we can get it up, is the specification for cognition and development, Laura. I just want to point you to that and say this kind of answers a lot of your questions in terms of, you know, do we need to know this? How much detail should we go in? What should we put in AO1? And that is refer to the spec again. I would say, obviously, timing is a great one for how much you should write. You know, a 4 marker, 5 marks roughly, etc. You know, the split for a 16 marker, 6 and 10, to work the timing out for that. But for Piaget's theory of cognitive development, all I would say to you is, again, it depends on the wording of the question, the amount of marks worth. But let's say that it was a 16 marker, a straightforward kind of outline value on Piaget's theory of cognitive development, let's say, I would like to be seeing in that answer the key specialist terminology, which I would arguably say is actually quoted in the spec. So that's what I want to be seeing in those stages. So hopefully that answers your question with kind of like when you're looking at theories like that, and you've got, if we refer to Vygotsky's, for example, here, we've got Vygotsky's theory of cognitive development, and then we've got including the proximal development and scaffolding. So if you get a 60 marker on Vygotsky, again, I'd be expected to see those 2 specialist key terms as part of his theory in your AO1. So hopefully, Jessie, that answers your question on that. What else have we got? If anybody's got a question, you want to do one-on-one, guys, because it's taken me a while to actually find a question in here.
Oh, somebody, Matilda Willis there has got a good question. Actually, says, do we need to know all the different types of determinism, including reciprocal? And again, and I think we've said this about 6 times, so it's an important message, is just go to the specification. So if Laura just pops the specification on again, so the specification will tell you exactly what you need to know in terms of what could come up as a question. Have you got the spec there, Laura? Fantastic. So there you go. So what have we got there for determinism? You've got hard determinism, soft determinism, biological, environmental, and psychic determinism. So although reciprocal determinism is a type of determinism, it's not going to be something you're explicitly asked a question on. That being said, if it was a 16 marker on determinism and you wanted to put that in, you could indeed do that. And that's the case, I think we pulled out in the session last night, you know, when you think of reductionism on here, it doesn't talk about machine reductionism on the spec, but it is also a type of reductionism. So it's the things on the spec, like Laura said earlier, what you will get the questions on. Anything off spec that you might have learned might be part of like a larger 8 or 16 mark question that you could use. Similarly for, like, you know, if you're looking at cultural bias and ethic and emic, they're not on the spec, so they're not going to ask you a question on them, but it would be part of a cultural bias answer if you wanted to include them.
I've got a question here by Zane. Would we need to know an example of an individual case study for the humanistic? When you say for the humanistic, I'm not sure what you mean there, but basically no is an answer to that. If you were using humanistic in any way, I can't think in the spec for paper 3. Can anybody?
I think maybe they've got confused with paper 2.
Or maybe your meaning is an example for idiographic, and if that's the case, to illustrate how humanistic is idiographic, you wouldn't necessarily need to give a case study. You can refer to the actual specialist terms in AO1 in humanism. And we've got Arya. When you say relative contribution, is that like treatments and real-world applications? Or so when Anne was speaking about relative contribution of the nature-nurture debate, we're talking about the contribution of both nature and nurture to a given behavior. So it's more to do with that, okay? And I would say, again, we've probably said this many times, but with issues and debates, it's really important that you can effectively communicate to the examiner how something's a debate. So like with nature nurture, it's about the relative contribution of each. And I'm telling you that wording comes up in the mark scheme pretty much every time for a nature nurture question. And I'm telling you, it's not been answered very well previously. So it's something to definitely get right this time in terms of how you explain why something is a debate. For example, reductionism, holism, that's the debate about what level of explanation best suits explaining this given behavior. Is it a lower level, a mid-level, a higher level? It's not to say that being holistic every time is the be-all and end-all. That's the best option. It's not about that. It's about how well can this level explain this behavior. And sometimes actually from a reduced level, let's say biological lower level, sometimes that is seen as a plus, because actually we can come up with treatments and treat the masses, if you like. So it doesn't always have to be a weakness when we're saying that something is reductionist. And the same when we say that it's a weakness that is deterministic. It's not always a weakness. So it's something to really think about. Too many students go straight thinking that's a weakness, and it's often not very well kind of propped up in an essay because of that. So really think about both sides here. That it could be a strength, could be a weakness, and as long as you're justifying it, great.
Okay, I picked up one. It was OK. A question from OK about using gender and culture bias in schizophrenia in a gender or culture issues and debates answer. Have we got that one, Laura?
I'll just try to find it.
It's quite recent. And my answer was yeah. I mean, if that is a relevant example that helps you to illustrate either it's an example of gender bias or an example of culture bias, but it comes from schizophrenia, that is really good. Yeah, use it because that's what they, especially if it's in a question where you've been asked to refer to topics. But what you've got to be careful with is not to just go off on a tangent and start writing a schizophrenia essay, because it's not. You could just, the essay might be about gender bias or it might be about culture bias in psychology. So just make sure that you're using it as an example, not that it doesn't then become the focus of your essay. We've got who are the main who are the main psychologists you need to know for paper 3? Well, again, that's like an impossible question to answer in this amount of time. You do need to go through the specification for your options, and you need to highlight any named psychologists within there, because you definitely need to know about those. And then obviously within the topic areas, there will be key psychologists that you should know about. But, we can't say that because it's an options paper. But, there are certain key ones that you should know about. But, yes, you should know the names of key psychologists. But don't worry, when you're writing your essay and maybe you're including some research to support something and you can't remember the name and you certainly can't remember the date, don't spend ages sitting there trying to remember the name, because it isn't important. Don't feel like the need to make one up. Just say some research was done to support this, which, this showed this, whatever. As long as you're writing about it clearly so that it's recognizable to the examiner, then that will be absolutely fine. Because, sometimes we can't remember names anyway. Certainly under the pressure of an exam, names can be really difficult to remember. So, don't worry over much. It's far more important, rather than just dropping in the odd name here and there. It's far better to be able to explain a study clearly, why it supports the point you're trying to make, and then the examiner will pick that up.
Well, what a session. I think you've answered a 10 ton of questions there. I know some people are asking, can we do more on options? We'll do a couple now before we go. We're also going to put content on our Instagram tonight, so we'll go through the chat. Anything that we haven't got round to, we will put on there. We know there's been a little bit of a lag, but I suspect once it uploads to YouTube, it'll be fine. So you can go back. Let's whiz through a couple of these. Let's see. Relationships, duck phase model. Anna?
What? So what is it? Is that the question? Does it look like?
Yeah. Can you give us an overview, a bullet point list of what you might put in AO1 and what you might put in AO3 if you were going to outline and evaluate this?
I mean, your best thing to do is look at the mark scheme from last year, because it was an 8-marker. So it's just about going through the different stages of the model. I'd also talk about things outside of the stages in a 16 model, like talk about, the fact that it's linear. The idea is that you have to progress through all the stages. For evaluations, I'd always talk about the extra, update of the model by Rolly and Duck, adding in that resurrection stage in it. I'd talk about the usefulness for kind of like therapy as well. Maybe talk about, the lack of discussion in Duck's model about the preceding factors for that breakup happening, essentially. But yeah, the best thing to do is just look at, like I say, the mark scheme from last year, because that was an 8 marker on last year's paper. It's a neat one, but I would say in a 16 marker for duck, you're going to have to go a bit beyond just naming each stage and describing it. You're going to have to talk about the
Would you say
nature
it would be
of what
more likely to be an application, maybe, if it was going to go for 16 marks?
It could be, couldn't it? I could see it easily being an application, actually,
Yeah.
as that.
I
Yeah, for
think
sure.
that's been an application of it before.
That'd look nice, actually.
Okay, great answer. Can we have a quick distinction between emic and etic, Anne?
Okay, an ethic. Well, we talk about. I knew you could do that to me. Talk about an imposed ethic is where you develop a measuring instrument in one culture and then you import it and use it in another culture. Think about the strange situation and whether that was appropriate. That was an imposed ethic because it was developed based on sort of American and British ideas of how securely attached and insecurely attached children behaved, and then it was used in all in different cultures where it may not have been appropriate. So that's what we mean by an ethic or imposed ethic. An emic approach is always the one that's a bit more vague, but it's about having to develop approaches to study things that are applicable for the culture that they're going to be used in. So you might have to study it in a different way in each culture, but then of course that makes it very difficult to compare things, which is perhaps why you get less sort of emic studies than you do ones that use imposed ethic. Because another example would be intelligence tests of an imposed ethic.
They can use emic as evaluation, can't they? So if you're saying something's culture biased, you can propose, actually, if you take an emic approach, then that's one way to kind of minimise the effects of culture bias. Okay. Turners and Klinefelters, anybody? This is for gender. Yeah, this is for gender. So what somebody did ask today on Instagram, actually, can you talk about this, Turners and Klinefelters, which is atypical chromosomes? Can you talk about it if atypical gender comes up? And it's strictly no. It's probably one of the most common mistakes with that, and you can sympathise because it's atypical chromosomes, atypical gender, but it is a strict no. For Turners and Klinefelters, just make sure that you can that they are completely separate. Turners for females, Klinefelters for males. Make sure that you can talk about what they are. Mention the specific chromosomes, so XO for Turners, XY for Klinefelters. Talk about some of the physical and psychological characteristics. That could come up as a multiple choice question, you just never know. Could be a small one, could be application, could be essay. And then for evaluation, which I do think it's a hard area for evaluation, try and look at things like mosaic Turners or mosaic Klinefelters, which refers to the idea that you can't just say, and it kind of ties in with our nomothetic chat before, we can't just say that everyone who has Turners is going to have it like this, or Klinefelters, because actually if you get 10 people with these conditions in a room, they probably all have different symptoms, different severity, onset ages differ as well, and that's what we mean by mosaic. So you can have that as a point. You can also mention implications for treatment, hormone therapies. You can also talk about the importance of identifying it early on. People tend to cope better if it's identified early on, treated, interventions and so on. So I wouldn't necessarily go overboard with evaluation in terms of learning loads of points, but just maybe pick 3 and try and do them as best as you can. Remember, half the battle is elaborating and structure, so pick up some of the tips that we've used tonight. Okay, what about difference between reductionism and determinism, Laura?
Yeah, okay, so with reductionism, like I said before, we're talking about different levels of explanation to explain a given behaviour. So we have our lowest levels at the kind of level of kind of particles, atoms, our biology example, and then at our highest level, obviously, in terms of the spectrum of the debate, we've got our more holistic explanations. So really good examples, students often miss this when they talk about holism in the exam, is that it's not just nature and nurture as a simplified view. We don't want to get muddled with nature nurture here. We want to give examples of holism such as social, cultural, upbringing, SLT, biological, all of that encompassed to give a more holistic view on a given behaviour and why it's developed. Whereas determinism, we're talking about control. So how much control do we have over our outcomes? behaviour, if you like. Okay, we've got hard determinism, soft determinism, which encompasses some free will, and don't forget we've got our biological, environmental, and psychic. You need to know those, and like I said before, really good when you're using these types of reductions or determinism in evaluation for a paper 3 topic, that you can be as specific as possible with your terminology. So, for example, if you're talking about psychic determinism, say psychic determinism.
Fantastic, thank you. A couple of quick ones. So George has asked, which is a good suggestion actually, if you can't find your spec, I'm just going to show them very quickly now. You can pause them on the video when you play back. So you've got we've got relationships, gender. And while I'm flicking through these, it's a good chance to say, and this is going to sound like daft advice, but honestly, don't be the person that answers the question that you haven't studied. A lot of people tend to do that. So if you've done your options with your teacher, make sure that they're the ones that you answer. Sometimes you might see things, especially in stress, you'll recognise some of it from biopsychology and think, oh, I know this, I'll answer that one. But you won't have the depth to do it. So just try and stick to the ones that you've actually studied in class. So there they are. You can go back and watch this on YouTube and pause it if you can't find. I muted, didn't I? Do we need to know the ways of measuring crime for statistics? No, it was taken out the spec ages ago. You'll still see it in some resources, but you don't need to know it. What else have we got? This question came up. So there's no evaluation for issues and debates. There is, I think you're confused there. AO3 is for evaluation, like we spoke of tonight. So that, I think that's just terminology, but make sure you iron that out before you go through to the exam. And then we've got, do you always need to put in evidence from research? If it asks you to refer to a topic, then you do need to refer to topics. You may choose to put some evidence in as part of your evaluation.
I think if in topics, in any essay, evidence to support something, if you're evaluating a theory or an explanation, I think giving evidence from research studies is really good evaluation, provided it is relevant and it does support, or evidence to challenge. I think that research evidence and findings of research studies is really good, and it does get you quite a lot of marks, to be honest.
Yeah, but the only thing is, don't be tempted to write 2 pages on what happened in a study.
No. Yeah,
that happens at the Bobo doll, doesn't it? But just use it effectively. Okay, nearly done. Can you write about examples from year 1? Yes, you can. Absolutely no problem with that. Can you start with issues, with options first and then to your issues and debates? You can do what you like, just make sure you manage your time. And then final question for the night. Let's go for 1 answer each. Any example that you'd use for idiographic and nomothetic? Anna, we'll start with you. I know we've mentioned this a few times, but it's a nice one to wrap up with.
Yeah, I think I'd go to approaches for this, really. And if I was doing idiographic, I'd pull out primarily the humanistic approach being the most idiographic of approaches, and then kind of nomothetic end, perhaps use like behavioural, biological.
Okay, Laura? Any others?
Yeah, I give you social influence is a really good one for nomothetic, particularly with conformity theories with Ash, obedience theories. So that's a really nice topic to have examples for nomothetic.
And
anything kind of scientific where they're looking at general laws. For idiographic, if you're focusing on the methods, then yes, you can bring psychodynamic, you can bring in Freud's case studies, and that would be an example of idiographic.
And don't forget, research methods relates as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, definitely. So it's about the approaches, like you could talk about the experimental method being nomothetic, you could talk about the case study approach being idiographic. You can then talk about data types, so quantitative is nomothetic, idiographic is qualitative. So yeah, it links to, I would say really, it links really nicely to research methods and approaches for sure.
Okay, right, we've gone through loads tonight, which has been great. Thank you to you 3 for joining us and sharing your expertise. This session will be on YouTube soon. Hopefully the lag sorts itself out